Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, yes, they did. They absolutely got it right. And the media keeps on proving that over and over. And there's so much going on. So much going on locally, so much going on in the state of Ohio, as well as the national stuff. Some of the things that I mentioned to you last week about the Ohio gubernatorial race is pretty exciting. We're seeing some interesting things going on, and we're very delighted to see that, let's see, it's Mary Taylor that just got endorsed by Ted Cruz. So I think that's pretty interesting when it really comes down to conservatism and having a strong conservative like Ted Cruz endorse Mary. So I'm pretty excited about that. I really like what's going on with her campaign. But what I want to do today is to open up, as I mentioned last week a little bit. I want to start doing this over and over again a little bit, is because as we will be talking about promoting the book From Covenant to the Present Constitution Workbook, I thought it most appropriate that we look at something. They preached liberty, because they did. And as you know, and as Samuel Adams definitely being that last Puritan, the ministers that he sat under were very, very strong Puritan teachers and preachers, and it is about liberty. I did see a post this past week on Facebook where someone was putting up this a post, and it ended up, I think, in Christianity something today, or one of the main Christian periodical things. Some professor out of the University of Notre Dame was talking about liberty and that how it's become idolatry. And to some extent, one has to agree with that, especially if you're looking at pure libertarianism. That would be, in all essence, libertine, which would be relative to the French Revolution. And I did not speak of it, but that is exactly what Abraham Kuyper was talking about in 1898 when he came and talked at Princeton. And he was differentiating between the American Civil War and what true liberty is based on the true perspective of the gospel versus what happened in the French Revolution, where there was no moral context. And sadly, the Catholic Church was not sufficient. And remember that at that time, the Reformation was beat down and virtually castigated inside of France, just as that French Revolution came to its fruition. And what that meant was there was no moral context as we had in the American Revolution. So when we think about they preached liberty, they did not preach liberty from the libertine or the French Revolution perspective, where it has now become almost that same sense of idolatry. So I kind of agree with the guy in that respect, but more so what we have is that they preached liberty from that Great Awakening, what became known as the First Great Awakening, where we had Reformation in the churches in America, and where we had personal reformation, or we had people that were coming once again into strong relationships, personal relationships with the living God. Made a big difference in how the American Revolution came about and actually worked. So with that, I wanted to open up with this whole idea of the price of liberty. While liberty is fruitful in trade, industry, wealth, learning, religion, and noblest virtue, all that is great and good and happy. Slavery clogs every sublimer movement of the soul, prevents everything excellent, and introduces poverty, ignorance, vice, and universal misery among the people. But if a few general terms can give no tolerable idea of the blessings of freedom, let them be learned from the story of the world. Let their richness be estimated by the price that has been paid for them, in lands that have been favored with them, and particularly by our progenitors. Heaven grant that the present generation may come by a just sense of the excellency of their civil and sacred immunities, as may be necessary for the same at a cheaper rate than by experience of such suffering as our ancestors underwent. This was by Charles Turner of Duxbury, Massachusetts, election sermon, 1773. So at this point, when he was giving the sermon, we didn't even have the revolution yet, but he was talking about those that already had fought, that had already given their blood, that had already sacrificed in the colonies to maintain an idea and a sense of liberty. So as we think about that, and we think about all of the different things that are going on in social media, all of which is occurring from that whole perspective of the excuse me, lawsuits with Google, the stuff with Facebook, lawsuits with Facebook for, as those that are watching me on YouTube, capturing your face and taking and using it. They only, I think it's, what is it? They only have to capture your face like 15 times, and then they can utilize it and store it and reference it and cross-reference it and all of that. And apparently in one of the states, that's absolutely illegal because your face is your personal property. Go figure. Oh, geez, it's your personal property. Well, I don't even want to go down that road because, you go down that and you start talking about, well, yes, it is. It is your personal property. And according to the class action, this is really cool. I don't know how big that class action suit's going to be allowed to get, but it's really cool that it is a class action lawsuit, so that way Facebook, with all of their power and attorneys, can't squash individuals. And Facebook is crying that it could cost them billions of dollars in having to pay people for inappropriately using their faces and so on and so forth. You have to go check out the lawsuit. Go figure that one out. So let's kind of, before we ratchet into some of the other things that I want to touch on and spend time in the last couple segments on really promoting the book and what we're going to be doing with the rejuvenating the seminars. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a while, but I wanted to follow up from last week. And how are we doing on time, Kath? We're about down to that last 5 minutes here in this segment as we open up. But I wanted to come back to the amendments to the Constitution that were being submitted at all the different states were submitting these various amendments. And some of them we covered last week from Massachusetts and Virginia. But I thought what Rhode Island had was very, very interesting. And there's 3 of them that were brought forward in my favorite little book on the Anti-Federalist Papers. That is the paperback version of what I have digitally, but at least it's a paperback version. Anyway, Rhode Island came up with these 3 in March of 1790. And think about that date as to when the Constitution was written, when it was ratified, and now in 1790 what we have. And this one goes like this, which I think is extremely important. And this was their number 3, is that the powers of the government may be reassumed by the people whensoever it shall become necessary to their happiness, that the rights of the states respectively to nominate and appoint all state officers and every other power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by the said Constitution clearly delegated to the Congress of the United States or to the departments of government thereof, remain to the people of the several states or their respective state governments, to whom they may have granted the same, and that those clauses in the said Constitution which declare that Congress shall not have or exercise certain powers do not imply that Congress is entitled to any powers not given by the said Constitution, but such clauses are to be construed either as exceptions to certain specified powers or as inserted merely for greater caution. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is very, very important in that this one alone, if it would have been ratified, would have actually taken all of the Hamilton insanity and out of the picture. It would have clearly taken the welfare, general welfare clause and the commerce clause totally out of the picture from misinterpretation. This would have been a very good amendment to have, whereas we would have been able to further secure the definitions inside that original Constitution, such as it says, such that you wouldn't misconstrue the welfare clause, the general welfare. What's the general welfare? You know, I've talked about that, and we talk about it in the book, where it becomes one of the greatest confusions that today is causing us to go down the road of socialism. The Anti-Federalists argued about general welfare. They argued to a certain extent around the Commerce Clause, but the general welfare has opened up such a can of worms, it is amazingly ridiculous. And I say that in jest as well. So when we look at that alone, and as we spend just a couple minutes that I think are remaining, is that what we're looking at is what does that mean? And what protection would that have given us if somewhere along the line we either would have had this amendment or we were able to codify this? We don't even have this in code. We don't have this in U.S. law. So it allows Congress to run amok. It allows a number of those other things to occur because of that. Now, number 6 out of Rhode Island was that elections of representatives in the legislature ought to be free and frequent, and all men having sufficient evidence of permanent common interest with and attached to the community ought to have the right of suffrage, and no aid, charge, tax, or fee can be set, rated, or levied upon the people without their own consent or that of their respective representatives so elected, nor can they be bound by any law to which they have not in like manner assented for the public good. Ladies and gentlemen, there's more in a submission that I will be talking about in the presentation as a clarification of these amendments and how it all fits together into covenant as we get into our discussion, and as well as what's in the book. But what's interesting about this is that when it comes to the vote, you have to have an attachment to the community. You see, that's very, very critical. So with this voter voter stuff that goes on, and that people can be registered to vote, and then we have a lot of illegals voting, and all this continuation of voter fraud, it is very clear that the intent, and if we had that intent, again, it's there, it's the intent that the people of Rhode Island had, as did the people of the number of other states, is that, you know what? The only way that you could vote and have suffrage is that if you had evidence of a pertinent common interest with and attachment to the community. You see, when we have all of these others that are running around just crazily talking about the rights of illegals or the rights of green carders or all of this, ladies and gentlemen, these people are so off base from original intent that it's not laughable. It brings tears to my eyes and should to yours. And we should be jumping up and down requiring clarification within the U.S. Code. So with that, we're going to come back in the next segment as Samuel Adams returns, because those Anti-Federalists got it right with a little bit more from, yes, Rhode Island. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, yes, they did. They got it right. You know, I see that every day. And this week, as I mentioned before, really plays it out. Yes, this is Tom Navolis, your host, and just delighted that you are here with me. And from the last segment, we were talking about the Rhode Island proposed amendments in 1790, and that the first one would have given us really good clarification as to what the General Welfare Clause couldn't go haywire, and we wouldn't have all of this social nonsense, be it social justice, whatever, and the welfare system and socialism that has encroached into the whole perspective and concept of our republic. Geez, how does that fit together? A socialistic republic. Yes, California. Oh my goodness. You know, they're doing so many things out there that I know you're aware of from the general media, but it's just amazing. And then, as I mentioned, as we finished up the last segment, out of the three proposed amendments that Rhode Island had, number 3 really focused on elections, and that it was that the people needed to have a common interest and attachment to the community to be able to vote. So in other words, just as we should have it, if you live in your precinct, you vote in your precinct. And in your precinct, you may have for your community that there's a school bond issue, which I have one going on in my community that is, figure this one, get this. So this is going to be a 3.56 mil levy over 38 years. Think about that. A 3.56 mil. So that means that it's like, what is that? That's almost like, what? That's a lot of money. I never remember the formula, so if I was going to quote that, I'd probably mess it up. All I know is that a lot of the savings that we've been doing to reduce our cost of living is going to be eaten up by this levy. And, you know, what's really interesting is that this is going to be a 2-generation levy. Think about that. 38 years. 38 years of taxation at that rate that'll never go away in my lifetime. So I'm not going to live another 38 years, you know. I mean, I'm in the prime of my life now, and holy smokes, that's going to be interesting. So anyway, it goes to the attachment of your community and interest. So, you know, those are where you should be able to vote. So that means that you should only be able to vote in your community, in your precinct, in the district that you're in the county that you're in the state that you're in. So your residency gives you a right to vote. And that's what they were talking about. And you know something? The way that Althusius talks about things, which we're going to talk about in the book a little bit, is that, you know what, if you don't, and this goes to what our founders also spoke of, is that if you don't like how your community is, and the majority of people do, then move. You've heard me say that before. It's not for you to try and change Mr. Hogface and all of the other socialists and communists and the Obamas and so on and so forth. No. It is, if you want to be a socialist, communist, progressive, go somewhere else where that's acceptable. America is a constitutional republic, and that's not something we really, really want, but because we quit teaching that in the schools, that's really, really what we have gotten. And that's what we talk about in the book as well, and really bring it out in the seminar. So back to this. So that's what your suffrage should be, is that you should vote according to those interests and common attachment. Now this other one is really fun. I don't know what you're going to think about this one, but I thought it was pretty cool. Is that Rhode Island thought in cases of direct taxes, income tax, IRS, direct taxes, okay, Congress shall shall first make requisitions of the several states to assess, levy, and pay their respective proportions of such requisition, in such a way and manner as the legislatures of the several states shall judge best. Period. And in any case, in any state shall neglect or refuse to pay its portion pursuant to such requisition, then Congress may assess and levy such states proportion together with interest at a rate of 6% per annum from the time prescribed in such requisitions. Boy, there's that 6% again. It was funny, what, Massachusetts had that, Virginia had that. It seems like 6% in the day was not an egregious amount to charge a state, and it was, a righteous form of punishment and influence. Pay up, otherwise it's going to cost you more. And to the extent, based on the Constitution, maybe they could send somebody to go knocking on the governor's door. Interesting. Anyway, some of their other interests were, which I absolutely believe in, because this is why we have and ended up ratifying a Second Amendment, is that, Rhode Island said, as standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be kept up except in cases of necessity, and as at all times the military should be under the strict subordination of the civil power, and therefore no standing army or regular troops shall be raised or kept up in time of peace. So we have a very, very large military-industrial complex. Now this goes to something that I talked about last week and came out of Virginia, is that there should be no specific forms of commerce given over one to another. So, when we think about this large military complex, if we are always at some kind of state of war, then we can keep standing armies, then we need to add, more troops, and yes, we have all of these global issues, and yes, we have this, but, you know what? If we went back to properly training and manning our militias, our citizenry, and having our state militias well prepared, yes, we have to have a Navy that was constitutionally satisfied. Air Force, in my mind, kind of falls into that whole Navy thing because of air power now is another means of commerce as the oceans are. So therefore, to protect commerce and our civilians that are flying in the air power makes a whole lot of sense to me from that in a defensive format, which could be brought to some of those other requirements in the Constitution to protect our borders, to protect the nation, missiles, things like that. Those make sense. Ladies and gentlemen, I had a quick battery change, if you didn't notice, a little bit of a blip glitch and all of that. So I'm segueing back from talking about the Air Force and all of that information that we just did out of Rhode Island and the amendments. So what we now have is that I wanted to continue on with a couple additional ones that they talked about here, and we just finished talking about that on the standing armies, and I kind of ad-libbed a little bit more about Air Force and what that means, and the Navy. One of the ones I thought was additionally important was that number 17 out of their list is that as a traffic tending to establish or continue the slavery of any part of the human species is disgraceful to the cause of liberty and humanity, that Congress shall, as soon as may be, promote and establish such laws and regulations as may effectually prevent the importation of slaves of every description into the United States. As many historians aren't willing to talk about, but the reality and facts is that it was not only blacks that were being brought into the United States at the time. but it was also those of many other other people types and people groups. So slavery was not just a black thing. That was the majority of people that were brought into the United States, but the reality is that there were so many other folks that were being brought in that it was just disgraceful any way that you looked at it. So with that, I just want to start looking at then the preventing tyranny. And what was in this book again, and this is kind of where we're at before we get into the new book, is the whole idea that the Anti-Federalists pressed their charges that the powers given to the central government under the new Constitution would be tyrannical. The Federalists had increasingly to deny any oppressive tendencies in it. And so what you had was Madison. He just jumped in there and he did a lot of large arguments, talking about United Nations, the threatened liberty, and I don't mean the United Nations, but just that of United Nations, large United Nations, did stop tyranny. But when we look at what de Tocqueville had to say, and when he came to America in those mid to late 1840s, and he actually did his compilation and writing around 1850 and released it then, we see that he talks about very clearly a soft despotism, a soft type of tyranny that could come into America if we, the people, did not continue to stay, number one, true on our faith. So number one, true on our faith. And then secondly, if we did not keep a clear understanding of the intent of our form of government. Those are several of the, two primary aspects that de Tocqueville talked about, as well as, the famous quote that he says that the greatness of America wasn't in the Constitution, it wasn't in the hills, it wasn't in the harbors, it wasn't in the farms, it wasn't in the cities. Where was it? It was in the pulpits. So once again, that's what we always must see. And we haven't been. We haven't seen that in the pulpits now for almost 100 years, if not more. So I'd say, well over 100 years if you take it back to the 1840s, which I talk about in the book. Then when we start looking at what all of that means. So bottom line is that when you look at it, the Federalists really kind of messed us over a little bit and what was going on, and we talk about that. And so I'm holding up here to the camera again for those that are on YouTube. I know that you listening on the radio can't see it, but the cover of From Covenant to the Present Constitution workbook. We are getting ready to launch in June the seminars, and we are going to talk, as I mentioned before, a little bit more about the book. We're going to kind of go through in detail what the various chapters are and sections are as we move into the next segment. And as I said, we're going to promote the book at this time in the programming for today, and as well as next Saturday, and finish up the month of April with a real strong promo push. And next week will be pretty much all on the book and not doing the seminar, because I can't do a 6-hour seminar and talk about 304-page book in an hour program. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to talk about it, and we're going to talk about this as far as, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at where we are. We're at Liberty Works Radio Network, where Liberty does work for you. And this is a what? Listener-funded network. It's all about you. You are the ones, as you know, in our various markets that keep the programming going. And I thank you for that, as well as everyone else at the network. So I would ask that you continue to go and look at the host. If you're in the various markets that can listen to that other live programming during the week, that you do so and get a real grip on what's happening in your local area, as well as do what? As I always say, go ahead, find that button there that says donate, and press that donate button and put some ducats in the bucket when Samuel Adams returns here on Liberty Works Radio Network, because Liberty does work for you, and Sam Adams always had it right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this last segment of Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. They absolutely got it right. Here on Liberty Works Radio Network, where, yes, liberty always will work for you. This is Tom Navolis, your host again, and wow, we have so much that we need to talk about relative to the new book, the seminar, but I kind of want to bring it back just a titch on something that I heard from Rush Limbaugh's Wednesday program. I have to admit that Rush is really, I quit listening, and Kathy and I both quit listening to Rush for a long period of time. Now Rush is really like Kathy's number one go-to guy that's out there. And I sit in from time to time and pick up some stuff that I'm going, wow, he's nailing it, he's getting it. He's not playing all the emotionalism. He's not doing all of the Hannity scramble or the Tucker, stuff. And, Ingram's doing a better job on her TV program than sometimes what happens on her radio program. But, let's talk about the leftists. Let's talk about Hannity for a second, and having his Fourth Amendment rights absolutely violated by what occurred in the courtroom the other day, and being exposed. And as Rush put it, it was the CNN attorney. And so I'm having a hard time understanding, because I don't know what was happening in that court case, but how is it that a CNN, which is a TV network attorney, not even the attorney, Mueller's persecutor, but a CNN attorney can take and press the judge to force a defendant to reveal all of his other clients. And in particular, this wasn't all of the clients, but in particular pushing to have Hannity exposed. That to me is very interesting and a very great violation of what we talk about in the seminar, and how so many different areas that should be protected in the rule of law are violated. But then what was very interesting that Rush started doing is that he started exposing all of these other talking head, CNN, NBC, ABC, all of the other alphabet of the mainstream media, or the mushed whatever they are, the liars and cheaters and deceivers, and what their associations are. And in particularly, and as you see in the promo, and you'll see here on YouTube, those that are going to that, is that he talks about, what is that, Chuck Todd and Chuck Todd's wife, and the millions that she made from Bernie Sanders, and he interviewed Sanders, and then the money that she got from, was it McAuliffe, or donated to I mean, it's really all this convoluted mess. And that's one of the prime examples where her company, she made over $3 million, I guess, or over, let's say over $2 million, so I don't get the story wrong. But, you can go look at the clip that I have there from YouTube, and you'll see that there's millions of dollars that Chuck Todd's wife has made by her direct association to people he's talked about and interviewed. Well, wait a minute. What are they doing slamming on the likes of Hannity when they're all tied together? And you could go through of who hobnobs with the other, and the incestuous relationships in the Democrats and in all of that. Not saying that the Republicans don't have their portion of that, but those that are calling the kettle black should, they'll never see a reflection in a mirror, because the mirror is so painted black with their evil and ideology. And that's what we're talking about. And as we get into from covenant to the present Constitution, and when I show this picture, ladies and gentlemen, you can't see it on the radio, but I show the Constitution all marked up with a black magic marker. And it's not that the words of the Constitution have changed. It's like I said last week and the week before, it's what's happened with the implementation of what we have in governance today. We no longer have a rule of law based on founders' intent for constitutionalism. And that's what this book is all about. It takes and it looks at all the wonderful framing of our Constitution, everything that, Hillsdale College talks about, Michael Petruka talks about, Dr. Kimber talks about, all of the others, and what's her name, Chris Ann Hall, and what she talks about on, just the framework of the Constitution itself, and what are those fundamentals that are in there that we should be doing for good governance. Well, that's all great, and that's all wonderful. But ladies and gentlemen, you need to know that framework. And I talk about that framing of the Constitution, and actually in the seminar utilize what I have permission for from Dr. Kimber in showing how that Constitution gets framed up. But at the same time, what I do more extensively is look at what does it mean from the clear understanding that our founders had in what is governance. What is it that they learned from the ancients? What is it that they learned from the reformers? Because that was where the big change was, is that we can look at Augustine and how he talked about governing and government and how we have that role, and even from that whole biblical perspective, an ancient perspective, because Augustine was really, really good at that. But then we have to go to Althusius and start looking at what does it mean, and as most will say, and I do a lot of quoting from a professor from Temple University and also a university out of Jerusalem who understands covenant, and he talks about covenant in the relationship of what it means from a Christian perspective. So here's a Jewish gentleman, this scholar, that writes about our foundation is based on covenant from a Judeo-Christian perspective, and that our founders understood that very, very clearly, and they understood, and especially Sam Adams, because I think I said something about it last week, is that as I've been reading and going through, I can take and put Althusius in this hand, and I can put Sam Adams in this hand and reading them, and there's much of the writings are actually almost verbatim. So when we look at that and understand that the likes of Althusius is someone who very clearly spoke of what? Federalism. In fact, Eleazar calls him basically the father of federalism, as we take and we understand that all the way down to the family level. Now, I got to confess, I never looked at my family from a federal perspective. Maybe if I did, I would have done some different things, some things a little bit differently. But that's not getting us into the table of contents of the book. What do we have in time, Kath? We've got about 6 minutes here, so let's take a quick look. So I have a good section in here on my comments as to how the book came about, what it took in about 10 years of study, and to get to the detail and the research and trying to compile this thing from what I did as a seminar first. And then I talk about the housekeeping mechanic, because I have taken every slide from the old presentation and expounded on those slides in very great detail. So the slide numbers that you will see in the book aren't necessarily going to correspond to the new presentation that we're launching in June, but I'm articulating in the new presentation which are the corresponding slides. So that way you're not going to get lost. But you know what? When you come to hear a presentation, you want to hear a little bit more of the detail. So I thought it would be really good to expand that. And yeah, I have to say, it is about a 6-hour lecture. So, come on, join us. We'll provide lunch, and we'll come to your area, and we can work that out with those who would like to host that. You can contact me at tom@samueladamsreturns.com to schedule up, to either schedule up a seminar or to buy a signed copy of the book, because we'll be glad to ship that to you. So I go through that housekeeping mechanics and how the book's kind of laid out. And one of the things that I say in there, in the housekeeping in particular, is, I drive editors crazy, because I have this voice that you hear on the radio and people see me actually talking. I kind of write like that. And so that drives people crazy. It's not the perfect English. It's not all this perfect stuff. And editors go out of their minds trying to ensure that the content is solid and it flows based on my voice. So that's what you're going to get. And I make no apologies for it whatsoever. Then I get into the introduction. And we talk very heavily in the introduction about what came about additionally. And then we talk about the rest of the story. And that's where I get into covenant in its context. What does it mean? What happened to covenant in America? What happened? That was something all the way up till the mid-1800s that was very well understood. So we talk about that in the book, and we talk about that also in, the seminar. And then we go into that constitutional overview. And I help take and build the Constitution as it was, which Dr. Kimber called it. He called it the Constitution as it was, the Constitution as it is, or as I suggested to him to call it, the Tale of Two Constitutions. We go through each and every article. I summarize them very, very quickly for you so that we don't have to belabor all of the other great content and teaching and information that's out there, and try and bring that to you very, very clearly. Then we get into the meat of it, that the was Constitution changed. Talk about American progressivism, what happened there, the impact of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. And then I show you the Constitution as it is. Talk about that 1900s progressivism and that transformation. 1913 being the worst year ever. The ratification of the 17th, what did it do? What was the Butler case? We look briefly, just a smidget at the Federal Reserve. Then I talk about the 21st through the 27th Amendments. And ladies and gentlemen, did you know that we already had a coup in America? We had a coup. We did. And I tell you about that. Then I talk about the supreme usurpation and what happened. What does the Supreme Court do? Divergence of the judiciary. Here's one that a lot of people won't talk about. Or if they do, they kind of glaze over it. Treaties, executive orders, and international executive agreements. I dive into the United Nations Treaty. Then I revisit oath. What does that oath really mean? So what results in this expanded Constitution? What about liberty? What is it? The present Constitution as it is. I then just draw that all together for you and what that means. Talk about de Tocqueville and what he said, that this new tyranny, a soft despotism, as I talked earlier, and then how false concepts were sold to you, me, and our previous generations. And then we talk about how do we stop this runaway consolidated government? How do we revive liberty and the love for it? How do we heal this Constitution? How do we get into this whole change up? And the change up is what I'm talking about in the presentation and adding various slides. And then how do we restore that wall of protection? Because I described what that wall of protection was earlier in the book. And then what does it mean to amend? Where do we really need to amend to be able to restore? What does that look like? And then most importantly, what are your action items? What is it we have to do? What is it that it means to get your butts out of the seats and your feet on the streets? I give you a conclusion and tons of references. I mean, there's almost 100 pages, not quite that. There's about 60, 70 pages of references alone, plus the footnotes. So, yes, there's a lot there. And again, contact me, Tom, at SamuelAdamsReturns.com to either get a signed copy of the book or to schedule up a seminar, and a book will be included in the seminar when I come to present it to you. So we have a lot there. We know what the founder's intent is. We talk about founder's intent. And most of all, we talk about Samuel Adams because he's returned, and we know those anti-federalists got it right here on Liberty Works Radio Network, where liberty does work for you.